this is going to be linking into quite a lot of themes that I think people have already talked about today. So firstly, James, when in his opening talk, talked about this idea of, in that one of the quotes you had, of kind of decolonisation as something not just like an intellectual project of like the elites, but also something that's kind of grassroots and that's built very much from the bottom. And then also in Antonio's talk just now, we have these references, these geographical spaces of exhibition, how important these like microgeographies of where these films are shown affects their meanings, affects the way that they invite different meanings, affects how they do decolonialism. So I'm going to be starting with here talking about postcolonialism and neoliberalism in Julien's Retrospective at the Tate. I don't know how familiar people are with any of Julien's work. He's a black British filmmaker, born in 1960. He started off in the workshop movement, so making films collectively in the 1980s. And then since then, he's now actually Sir Isaac Julien. He's become a bit of a kind of art celebrity. And he exists very much in what I'm calling a kind of neoliberalized art world. And that has specific gallery spaces as well that I'm going to go into. So I think it's good to start at the start, which is where he was when he first began, which is his first film. This film is called Who Killed Colin Roach? It's made in 1983. It's part of a community movement at that time for justice in the context of the violent police murder of a young black man in Stoke Newington in London. So we'll just watch a little bit. This is a clip from his website.
Miss Norma Richards and her 2 children were found murdered in their home in January 1983. They were the only black people living on their housing estate. Racist Nazi slogans were found on the walls of their houses. The police have no reason to believe that there was a racist Nazi motive behind this attack. Who they trying to fool? Her. The 12th of January 1983, Colin Roach found dead in Stoke Newington police station. And you think that the relationship between black people and the police is alright in happening? Yeah.
So that film is, I would say, very much part of the early 1980s, late 1970s community video movement. That was kind of using funding largely from local authority councils, and it was the formation of these kind of small film collectives that were working within communities to make films that were part of broader social justice movements. And in the 1970s, it was quite white, but in the 1980s, it moved into more racially diverse areas. So there were what was at that point called just generally black, but now we would call a combination of different ethnic identities that were at that point lumped into black. Well, that was a kind of political identity and political choice to identify lots of ethnic minorities as black. So the original context in which this was shown was this is a kind of poster from a small kind of art space in Dalston, and these were like really small spaces they're shown. They're very much like being shown for communities, they were also being shown for like interested other people. And this is kind of the context that it's in. So critical interest in these films at this point was not particularly well developed. This first film did not make a huge critical impact, and when it did make a critical impact, it was understood very much in terms of community video. So the movement itself was, community video quite deeply based in Paulo Freire's work. This idea of the camera as a weapon, he's got the pencil as a weapon there. And it's the idea that this could be a tool in a broader kind of liberation struggle. And again, we've got this was a community video magazine, that was what one of the reviews was. And then we've got on the right-hand side a small review which says, Isaac Julien's video of Who Killed Colin Roach was shown recently at the Rio Cinema in London. The Rio is a unique attempt to create links between the community and film work, between the street and the screen. The Colin Roach video was shown free at the beginning of the evening presentation for 2 weeks. And there's a question from the interviewer, Sean Cubitt, which says, was the Rio a good venue? And then the interlocutor is not the filmmaker, it's actually the leader of the community movement, the Colin Roach Justice Movement, who says, well, any kind of publicity is good publicity for a cause that is worth supporting. A lot of interest was generated and more than £80 of donations came in. So we start to see, at this point, this isn't really an art object. This is a community video. And it changes. So what happens is next, we get this change in Isaac Julien's context in which he's producing the films. He moves into the Sankofa Film and Video Collective, which again, this is getting money from the Greater London Council, it's getting money from the Council's Art Council as a way of building a community film movement that's going to say interesting things. And Channel 4 is also a crucial player in this. Newly created in 1980, Channel 4 was actually putting some of these films on TV and funding them as well. So what we're going to see here is a little bit from Looking for Langston, and then I'm going to discuss a bit about how kind of post-colonial theory starts to come more into Isaac Julien's work. The next slide. Let's see. Oh yeah, escape. Nice. Okay, brilliant. Okay, great. So that was a still from 1989, Looking for Langston. That was a really groundbreaking film. It has a huge cultural impact, especially in the US as well. And it kind of tracks the culmination of a move in Isaac Julien's practice, which starts to really incorporate theoretical ideas that were emerging in the 1980s. So I'm going to pick out a few. So firstly, we've got Paul Gilroy, 1988, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. And that kind of has an extremely influential theory in chapter 5, which is syncretism, which is kind of, and this is where maybe the talk kind of gets more into this decolonial rubric, which is syncretism is the idea that essentially in cities, especially he's talking about London, there's this kind of melting pot of cultures which produces within specific cultures kind of new forms of cultural expression. So he's talking a lot about music, and he's talking a lot about kind of rap and dub, and how those actually are these kind of new liberatory expressions for groups that respond to the conditions of kind of neocolonialism and post-colonialism. So these are often groups that have migrated from the British Empire into the UK historically, and these are the kind of second-generation migrants, often their response to those conditions of racism that they're experiencing. And this move to make a liberatory new culture. Homike Baba, also in 1988, comes out with Location Culture, he has a similar concept, hybridity. And hybridity is more of a literary concept here. So it emphasizes these spaces of contramodernity that allow a community to produce new truths about the European metropolis and modernity. And importantly, Barber sees these as coming from the colonial downtrodden, as well as from the metropolitan intellectual. So he says the precarious migrant class across the world, and he's also talking about, I think, more people like himself, who are kind of from a kind of transnational, he's, again, part of a kind of metropolitan intellectual class. And then I've also thought it was important to say that B. Ruby Rich's kind of work on nuclear cinema really also elevates Isaac Julien, and that's actually a still from Looking for Langston on her book. And she, again, plays into like queer identity as another kind of facet of this syncretism hybridity. So she writes, we're looking for Langston in 1989, Julien moved to a syncretic, meditative rewriting of history, queering Langston views. So I should say, I didn't really contextualise it, that clip we watched was from Looking for Langston, which is looking back at the Harlem Renaissance, looking back at Langston views, and imagining these spaces of liberation in New York, where you could be black and gay, and then it looks at how those spaces are being impinged on from different areas. So it's really kind of an examination of hybridity in New York in the 1920s from the perspective of someone that comes from a kind of hybrid space in London in the 1980s. So it's kind of multiple levels there. Okay, so then we get Isaac Julien kind of moving into the art world. And I want to give a bit of context to what's going on in the art world in the 1980s, 1990s. So the workshop movement I mentioned, Margaret Thatcher did not like it, and so she essentially shut down the GLC, which was one of the huge funding structures. She also reformed Channel 4, which meant that they really had to think about how they were going to like maximise viewership, so they had to move, they basically had their funding cut, so they had to put on more commercial programmes. So the programming slots that were showing things like Looking for Langston were no longer deemed to be viable by Channel 4. So we get closed, kind of shutting down the space for Isaac Julien to express himself artistically. We also get shutting down the collectives that were the kind of springboards for Isaac Julien and his colleagues to express themselves artistically. Also in the 1980s, the kind of bigger institutional art world is in crisis because Margaret Thatcher, again, is threatening to cut their funding unless they kind of reorient their institutional values to go along more with the market funding. So in the 1980s, we start to get the rise of corporate sponsorship of art galleries, and this is not really actually a huge funding source for them. It's more symbolic of the kind of like hustling they now have to do. They've got to sell tickets. They've got to get corporate sponsors in. And if they don't, there's always this threat hanging over them. Your central funding, your grant and aid will be cut if you don't kind of take on this commercial mindset. And at the same time, corporations are being hugely empowered in the 1980s. I think that's, Colin Crouch writes, that's probably like one of the biggest legacies of neoliberalism, is that policy program hugely increased the power of transnational corporations. And so as they're getting more powerful, art galleries start to need them more. There's a great quote from 1982 from the CEO of Pearson, who the first, Pearson Publishing were the first people to sponsor a Tate exhibition. And they write justifying their spending on this exhibition. I think it's like a Rembrandt exhibition or something. And they say, what we're doing is, we're just embodying Mrs. Thatcher's view that individuals and companies must do more and the state must do less. So this here, Nocturne, I put this up specifically because they sponsored the 2023 retrospective of Isaac Julien. And we'll talk a little bit more about the institutional politics of that in a second. So let's see. A few other issues I'll just kind of whiz through of reasons why the art world becomes attractive, why it becomes a kind of safe haven for kind of artists like Isaac Julien. Firstly, we have a change in technology. You can start to project video cheaply, and that fills up these kind of huge new spaces that are emerging, like Tate's turbine wall over up here. Secondly, and this is Erica Balsam writes a lot about this, is basically the art market finds out how to marketize film as an art object. They kind of crack it in the 1990s. And what they start to be able to do is sell films at editions. And essentially the film moves from being something like kind of community video, something on TV, to being something you can buy and sell as a commodity. And that links into kind of a new legal structure which allows you to basically put stipulations on the way that films are shown in different spaces. So it's kind of a new regime of control which allows them to be integrated into the art market. Then we also have in the kind of noughties, we have a new Labour-led kind of social exclusion unit, which kind of pioneers part of a move to create black art celebrities in British art. So there's Eddie Chambers writes about this a lot, and he writes that in the absence of direct agitation from black artists themselves and in the face of concerted governmental edicts, major arts institutions such as the Tate made benevolent gestures towards diversity. Black art became a bright and colourful component of multicultural inclusiveness based around the art celebrity. And this links into something I think James mentioned as well, the idea of diversity. So the idea that if you elevate single artists to very visible apexes of an industry, then in some ways that seems like the whole work is done, but there's a whole load of kind of actual liberatory work that just kind of gets a little bit swept on the carpet. So we get to Isaac Julien as a kind of post-colonial author, and this is where I'm going to start to talk about the specific exhibition. So this kind of exhibition, again, I don't know if anyone went, it had kind of an inside and an outside, and the inside was where we had these kind of works that are based in Isaac Julien as a kind of post-colonial intellectual. He's a post-colonial intellectual that goes and kind of comments on the hybridity of the world, the post-colonial experience, and he does it through these extraordinarily beautiful works of art. They're multi-screen, they're extremely sensitively curated, and they kind of really form the crux of this exhibition. And I think that there's a risk of this politics of like the intellectual genius that comes out in especially Homike Barbar's work, who's talking about literature, as a kind of main lens through which to read Isaac Julien's work. So Benita Parry writes, what's foregrounded by Barbar is the poetics of relocation and reinscription, known by the cosmopolitan artist, writer, intellectual, professional, financier, and entrepreneur in the metropolis, rather than the grim prose of low-wage workers in Western capitals and contract labourers in the Gulf states or other centres of capitalist growth in the Third World. Slightly problematic language there. But I do think that this kind of Isaac Julien as a kind of cosmopolitan, hybrid, syncretic intellectual really chimes in the art world